Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history from the remote hollows of Appalachia. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. The autumn of 1953 brought an unusual stillness to Crow's Nest Hollow, a remote valley nestled deep within the Appalachian Mountains of West Virginia's Pocahontas County. Local residents would later describe that particular season as eerily quiet, as if the very mountains themselves were holding their breath. It was during this time that the first documented complaints about the Mordant family reached the county sheriff's office, though the official records remained buried in filing cabinets for over a decade before anyone thought to examine them closely. The Mordant homestead sat at the far end of a winding dirt road that snaked through dense forest for nearly 8 miles from the nearest paved highway. The property itself consisted of a weathered 2-story farmhouse built sometime in the 1880s, surrounded by roughly 40 acres of increasingly wild land that seemed to press closer to the dwelling with each passing year. Those few visitors who had occasion to venture down that treacherous road invariably commented on the oppressive silence that seemed to emanate from the property itself, a quiet so profound it felt unnatural in a region known for its abundant wildlife and rushing mountain streams. Nehemiah Mordant, the family patriarch, had purchased the property in 1934 following what local records describe as his discharge from a state psychiatric facility in Huntington. The circumstances of his institutionalization were never made public, though a brief notation in the county clerk's files mentions a violent incident involving farm equipment and a neighbor's livestock in his previous county of residence. His wife, Cordelia, appeared in census records as having no previous address listed before their marriage in 1935, an unusual circumstance that raised questions decades later when researchers attempted to trace the family's origins. The couple's 2 grown offspring, Ambrose and Delphine, were both well into their 30s by 1953, yet neither had ever been recorded as having left the family property for any extended period. Employment records, school enrollment, medical visits, even basic social interactions with neighboring families were virtually non-existent for any member of the Mordant household. They existed in a state of almost complete isolation that seemed to defy the social norms of even the most remote Appalachian communities. The first official complaint filed against the family came from Garrett Holloway, a mail carrier who had been assigned the route that included Crow's Nest Hollow in September 1953. Holloway's report, discovered in 1965 during a routine archive reorganization, described an incident that occurred during his 3rd week on the job. According to his written statement, he had been instructed to deliver a certified letter to the Mordant residents requiring a signature from an adult member of the household. Upon arriving at the property, Holloway noted that all the windows of the house appeared to be covered from the inside with what looked like dark fabric or boards, despite the afternoon being bright and clear. When he approached the front porch and knocked, he was met by Ambrose Mordant, a gaunt man with prematurely gray hair, who answered the door wearing what appeared to be the same clothes he had worn during their previous encounters. What disturbed Holloway most, however, was not Ambrose's appearance, but the sound that emanated from within the house during their brief interaction. In his report, Holloway described hearing what sounded like a rhythmic scratching or scraping, as if someone were dragging their fingernails across wood in a deliberate pattern. When he asked Ambrose about the noise, the man's expression remained completely blank, and he claimed to hear nothing unusual. Throughout their entire exchange, which lasted only a few minutes, the sound continued without interruption, growing slightly louder, as if the source was moving closer to the front door. Holloway completed his delivery and left the property, but the incident troubled him enough that he mentioned it to several colleagues over the following weeks. When similar sounds were reported during subsequent mail deliveries, he began timing his visits to the Mordant property for the early morning hours, hoping to complete his duties before whatever was causing the disturbances became active. However, the sounds seemed to occur regardless of the time of day, leading Holloway to request a transfer to a different route after only 2 months of service in that area. The second complaint came from an unexpected source. Reverend Cornelius Blackthorne of the Pine Ridge Baptist Church filed a formal report with the county sheriff in November 1953, describing what he termed concerning spiritual matters related to the Mordant family. According to church records preserved in the County Historical Society, Reverend Blackthorne had received an unsigned letter requesting that he visit the family to perform what the writer described as necessary spiritual cleansing. The letter provided detailed directions to the Mordant property, but contained no other identifying information. Believing the request to be legitimate, Blackthorne made the journey to Crow's Nest Hollow on a cold Tuesday morning in late October. His subsequent report to the sheriff's office describes an encounter that left him deeply shaken. Upon arriving at the property, he was greeted not by any member of the family, but by an overwhelming stench that seemed to emanate from the general vicinity of the house. He described the odor as unlike anything he had encountered before, neither the smell of decay nor of unwashed living conditions, but something that reminded him of wet earth mixed with what he could only describe as something metallic and wrong. When Blackthorne knocked on the front door, it was answered by Delphine Mordant, a woman he estimated to be in her mid-30s, but whose appearance suggested someone much older. Her hair, completely white despite her apparent age, hung in long, unkempt strands around a face that was so pale it seemed almost translucent. What troubled the Reverend most was her eyes, which he described as having an unusual quality that made it difficult to maintain eye contact. She seemed to look through him rather than at him, as if she were seeing something beyond his physical presence. When Blackthorne explained the purpose of his visit and mentioned the letter requesting spiritual assistance, Delphine's expression changed in a way that he later struggled to articulate. In his report, he wrote that her face seemed to empty out, as if some essential aspect of her humanity had simply withdrawn, leaving behind only a shell that continued to speak and move, but contained nothing recognizable as a person. She informed him that no such letter had been sent from their household, and that they required no spiritual guidance of any kind. Throughout this exchange, Blackthorne became increasingly aware of sounds coming from within the house. Like the mail carrier before him, he heard a repetitive scratching or scraping, but he also detected what sounded like muffled voices engaged in some kind of rhythmic chanting or recitation. When he asked about these sounds, Delphine claimed that her father was reading aloud from agricultural journals, an explanation that Blackthorne found unconvincing given the cadence and tone of what he was hearing. As he prepared to leave, Blackthorne noticed movement in one of the upstairs windows that had not been completely covered. For just a moment, he glimpsed what appeared to be a face pressed against the glass, but it was withdrawn so quickly that he could not determine whether it belonged to Nehemiah or Cordelia Mordant. What disturbed him was the position of the face, which seemed to be at an odd angle, as if the person were lying down or positioned in some unnatural way. The Reverend left the property feeling deeply unsettled, but it was not until the following Sunday that he decided to file an official report. During that week he had been unable to shake the memory of his visit, particularly the sound of those muffled voices and the strange quality of Delphine's gaze. More troubling still were the dreams that began occurring the night after his visit to Crow's Nest Hollow, dreams in which he found himself standing in a dark room filled with the sound of scratching, while voices whispered words in a language he could not understand. In December 1953, a third complaint was filed by Ezra Cunningham, a hunter who had been tracking deer through the woods adjacent to the Mordant property. Cunningham's report describes an experience that occurred during the early morning hours of December 15th, when he was following fresh tracks through the forest that bordered the family's land. As he moved through the dense undergrowth, he became aware of a sound that seemed to be coming from the direction of the Mordant house, though the building itself was not visible through the trees. According to Cunningham's statement, the sound was unlike anything he had heard during his many years of hunting in those mountains. He described it as a low, rhythmic moaning that seemed to rise and fall in a pattern that was almost musical, but deeply unsettling. The sound was not continuous, but occurred in brief episodes, separated by periods of complete silence. During the quiet intervals, Cunningham noticed that even the usual forest sounds, bird calls, rustling leaves, distant water, seemed to be absent, as if the entire landscape were holding its breath. Curious, despite his growing unease, Cunningham moved closer to the edge of the Mordant property, following the sound through the trees until he reached a position where he could see the back of the farmhouse. What he observed from his concealed position among the trees would trouble him for the rest of his life. The rear yard of the property contained what appeared to be a large garden area, though the organization and content of this space was unlike any agricultural endeavor Cunningham had ever seen. The garden was laid out in a series of concentric circles, with each ring containing different types of plantings. The outer circles appeared to contain ordinary vegetables and herbs, but as Cunningham's eyes moved toward the center of the design, the plants became increasingly unfamiliar. Some appeared to be exotic varieties that should not have been able to survive in the harsh Appalachian climate, while others seemed to be arranged in patterns that suggested some kind of symbolic or ritualistic significance rather than practical agricultural purpose. At the very center of this circular garden stood a structure that Cunningham initially took to be a scarecrow or garden ornament. However, as he continued to observe, he realized that this central figure was moving in small, subtle ways that indicated it was a living person. The figure appeared to be an elderly man, presumably Nehemiah Mordant, standing motionless in the exact center of the garden, with his arms raised above his head in a position that must have been physically exhausting to maintain. The low moaning sound that had drawn Cunningham's attention was coming from this figure, who seemed to be engaged in some kind of extended vocalization or chant. The sound would continue for several minutes at a time, then stop abruptly, during which the figure would remain completely motionless. After a period of silence, the vocalization would resume, following the same rhythmic pattern Cunningham had noticed earlier. What made this scene particularly disturbing was the realization that the other members of the Mordant family were also present in the garden, though they were much more difficult to see. Ambrose and Delphine were positioned at different points within the circular plantings, and like their father, they remained motionless for extended periods before moving to new positions within the garden's geometric design. Their movements seemed to follow some predetermined pattern, as if they were performing a rehearsed sequence of actions that held specific meaning within the context of their unusual garden ritual. Cunningham watched this scene for nearly 30 minutes, during which time the family members continued their strange activities without any apparent awareness of his presence. As the morning light grew stronger, he became concerned about being discovered and began to withdraw from his observation point. However, as he turned to leave, he noticed that the moaning sound had stopped, and when he looked back toward the garden, all 4 family members were standing perfectly still and facing directly toward his location in the trees. Despite the distance and the intervening vegetation, Cunningham felt certain that they were looking directly at him, though he could not see their faces clearly enough to confirm this impression. The feeling of being observed was so intense that he abandoned any attempt at concealment and simply ran through the forest until he reached his truck. He drove directly to the county sheriff's office and filed a report describing what he had witnessed, though he acknowledged that much of what he had seen might have been misinterpreted due to distance and lighting conditions. These 3 complaints, filed within a span of just 4 months, represent the entirety of official documentation regarding the Mordant family during the 1950s. Sheriff Coleman Bradshaw, who received all 3 reports, conducted a brief investigation that consisted primarily of a single visit to the Mordant property in January 1954. According to his written report, he found the family to be eccentric but law-abiding, and he noted no evidence of any illegal activities or threats to public safety. Bradshaw's report mentions that he was invited into the house by Nehemiah Mordant, who appeared to be a lucid and articulate man despite his advanced age. The interior of the home was described as clean and well-maintained, though unusually dark due to the covered windows. When asked about the complaints filed by local residents, Nehemiah explained that his family followed certain traditional practices related to agriculture and spiritual observance that might seem unusual to outsiders, but were perfectly legal and harmless. The sheriff noted that all 4 family members appeared to be in good health and showed no signs of distress or coercion. He observed that their lifestyle was certainly unconventional, but fell within the bounds of their right to privacy and religious freedom. Based on this single visit, Bradshaw classified the previous complaints as resolved and took no further action regarding the Mordant family. This official dismissal of the concerns raised by local residents effectively ended any formal scrutiny of the family's activities. For the next several years, they continued to live in complete isolation, with only minimal contact with the outside world through occasional visits from delivery personnel and government officials conducting routine surveys or census work. Those few individuals who had reason to visit the property during this period generally reported similar experiences, an atmosphere of oppressive quiet, unusual odors, and the persistent feeling of being watched by unseen observers. In 1961, a significant change occurred in the family's circumstances. According to county tax records, Nehemiah Mordant failed to pay the annual property taxes for the first time since purchasing the land in 1934. When county officials attempted to contact the family regarding this matter, they discovered that the phone service to the property had been disconnected and that mail was being returned as undeliverable. A representative from the tax assessor's office was dispatched to investigate the situation in person. Deputy Tax Assessor Margaret Whittemore's report of her visit to the Mordant property in November 1961 provides the first detailed description of the family's living conditions since Sheriff Bradshaw's investigation 7 years earlier. Unlike Bradshaw's brief and superficial inspection, Whittemore's official duties required her to conduct a thorough examination of the property to determine its current value and condition for tax purposes. Upon arriving at the farmhouse, Whittemore noted that the building's exterior showed significant signs of deterioration. Paint was peeling from the wooden siding, several windows had been boarded up entirely rather than simply covered from the inside, and the front porch sagged dangerously in multiple places. The yard, which had been described as well-maintained during previous visits, was now overgrown with weeds and scattered with debris that appeared to have been accumulating for months. When Whittemore knocked on the front door, it was answered by Delphine Mordant, whose appearance had changed dramatically since her encounter with Reverend Blackthorne 8 years earlier. The woman who greeted the tax assessor seemed to have aged decades rather than years, with deeply lined skin and eyes that appeared to be covered by a milky film that suggested advancing cataracts or some other eye condition. Her clothing hung loosely on what was obviously a severely underweight frame, and she moved with the careful, hesitant steps of someone whose strength was nearly depleted. Whittemore explained the purpose of her visit and requested permission to inspect the property for assessment purposes. Delphine initially attempted to refuse entry, claiming that her father was ill and could not be disturbed. However, when Whittemore explained that failure to cooperate with the tax assessment could result in seizure of the property, Delphine reluctantly agreed to allow a limited inspection of the house's interior. The inside of the farmhouse revealed a living situation that was far different from the clean, well-maintained home that Sheriff Bradshaw had described 7 years earlier. Many of the rooms appeared to be completely unused, with furniture covered by sheets and thick layers of dust covering every surface. The windows that had been covered during previous visits were now completely boarded up from the inside, creating an environment of perpetual darkness that required artificial lighting even during the middle of the day. Most disturbing was the condition of the rooms that were still in use. Whittemore noted that the kitchen contained very little food, and what provisions were present appeared to be primarily preserved goods that could have been stored for extended periods. The cooking facilities seemed to be rarely used, with the stove and sink showing signs of neglect and disrepair. When she asked about these conditions, Delphine explained that the family had adopted a simplified lifestyle that required fewer material possessions and less conventional food preparation. As Whittemore continued her inspection, she became aware of the same strange sounds that had troubled previous visitors. The rhythmic scratching or scraping seemed to be coming from within the walls themselves, as if something were trapped in the space between the interior and exterior surfaces of the house. When she asked Delphine about these sounds, the woman claimed they were caused by settling timbers and expansion joints, explanations that Whittemore found unconvincing given the regular, deliberate pattern of the noises. During her time in the house, Whittemore encountered only Delphine and briefly glimpsed Ambrose, who appeared in a doorway leading to what she assumed was a bedroom or storage area. Ambrose's appearance was even more disturbing than his sister's, as he seemed to have lost a considerable amount of weight and muscle mass since the previous descriptions of him. His clothes hung on his frame like empty sacks, and his movements were slow and uncertain, as if he were struggling against some form of physical weakness or disorientation. When Whittemore asked to meet with Nehemiah to discuss the tax situation, Delphine explained that her father had become bedridden with a chronic illness that prevented him from handling business matters. She claimed that Cordelia, their mother, was serving as his caretaker and could not leave his bedside. This explanation seemed plausible given the family's obvious financial difficulties and declining living conditions, and Whittemore did not press for a meeting with the elder Mordants. However, as she prepared to leave the property, Whittemore noticed something that troubled her considerably. While walking through the downstairs rooms, she had observed that all the interior doors had been fitted with multiple locks on the outside, as if someone had taken deliberate measures to prevent the rooms from being opened from within. When she mentioned this observation to Delphine, the woman's explanation was that the locks were necessary to prevent drafts from moving through the house and disturbing her father's rest. Whittemore completed her assessment and filed a report recommending a significant reduction in the property's tax valuation due to its deteriorated condition. However, she also included a note suggesting that county health officials might want to conduct a wellness check on the family members, as their physical condition and living situation appeared to warrant some form of social service intervention. This recommendation led to a visit from County Health Inspector Vernon Dalby in December 1961. Dalby's report provides the most detailed account of the Mordant family's living conditions that exists in official records. Unlike previous visitors who had been limited to brief social calls or specific business purposes, Dalby's authority as a health inspector gave him the legal right to examine the property thoroughly and require corrective action for any violations of health and safety codes. When Dalby arrived at the property, he was greeted by Ambrose Mordant, who attempted to prevent him from entering the house by claiming that the family was currently observing a religious retreat that prohibited contact with outsiders. Dalby explained that his inspection was required by law and that failure to cooperate could result in condemnation of the property and forced relocation of its residents. Faced with this ultimatum, Ambrose reluctantly allowed Dalby to enter the house, though he insisted on accompanying the inspector throughout the entire examination. As they moved from room to room, Dalby documented a series of conditions that clearly violated multiple health and safety codes. The kitchen's water supply was contaminated with what appeared to be organic matter, possibly from a septic system failure or contaminated well. The electrical system was dangerously outdated and showed signs of amateur modifications that created serious fire hazards. Most concerning was the evidence of pest infestation throughout the house. Dalby observed signs of rodent activity in multiple rooms, including droppings, gnawed surfaces, and strong odors associated with animal waste. However, the infestation patterns were unusual in that they seemed to be concentrated in specific areas rather than distributed randomly throughout the building. The heaviest signs of pest activity were found in the interior walls, particularly in areas where the mysterious scratching sounds were most audible. When Dalby attempted to investigate the source of these sounds more thoroughly, he discovered that access panels and maintenance openings that would normally allow inspection of the wall cavities had been sealed with what appeared to be home-mixed cement. When he asked Ambrose about these modifications, the man explained that they had been necessary to prevent heat loss during the winter months. However, the extent and placement of these sealed areas suggested a more systematic effort to prevent access to the interior spaces of the house. As the inspection continued, Dalby began to notice that Ambrose's behavior was becoming increasingly agitated. The man seemed particularly nervous when the inspector approached certain areas of the house, especially a door leading to what appeared to be a basement or cellar area. When Dalby requested access to this lower level, Ambrose claimed that the stairs were unsafe due to structural damage and that the basement was used only for storage of household goods that posed no health risks. However, Dalby's examination of the door revealed that it had been secured with an unusually elaborate system of locks and bars that seemed designed to prevent access from either side. The door itself appeared to be much thicker and more heavily constructed than would be normal for interior use, and there were signs that the frame had been reinforced with additional metal supports. When questioned about these modifications, Ambrose became visibly distressed and began repeating explanations that were clearly rehearsed but made little practical sense. At this point in the inspection, Dalby began hearing the scratching sounds that had been reported by previous visitors. Unlike the others, however, his training as a health inspector required him to investigate potential pest activity thoroughly, regardless of the family's obvious discomfort with his presence. As he listened more carefully to the sounds, he realized that they were not random scratching or gnawing as might be expected from rodents, but seemed to follow a deliberate pattern that was almost rhythmic in nature. When he attempted to locate the exact source of these sounds, Dalby found that they seemed to be coming from an area of the first floor that, according to the house's layout, should have been part of the basement ceiling. However, when he measured the interior and exterior dimensions of the building, he discovered a discrepancy that suggested the basement extended beyond the footprint of the upper floors. This architectural anomaly implied that there were underground spaces that could not be accessed from within the main house. Dalby's growing concerns about the family's living conditions and the structural mysteries of the house led him to request a meeting with Nehemiah and Cordelia Mordant. Despite Ambrose's protests that his parents were too ill to receive visitors, Dalby insisted that his authority as a health inspector required him to verify the welfare of all residents. After considerable resistance, Ambrose finally led him to a bedroom on the second floor where the elder Mordants were supposedly confined. The room that Dalby entered bore little resemblance to a normal bedroom or sick room. The windows had been completely sealed with wooden boards and what appeared to be layers of fabric or blankets creating an environment of total darkness that made it impossible to see clearly without artificial lighting. The air in the room was thick with an odor that Dalby described as unlike anything in his professional experience, combining elements of human waste, rotting organic matter, and something chemical or medicinal that burned his nostrils and throat. In the dim light provided by a single kerosene lamp, Dalby could see two beds positioned against opposite walls of the room. Each bed appeared to contain a human figure, though the poor lighting and heavy blankets made it difficult to observe the occupants clearly. When he approached the first bed, Ambrose quickly moved to block his view, explaining that his father's condition required him to remain covered to prevent exposure to cold air or bright light. Despite Ambrose's interference, Dalby was able to observe that the figure in the first bed appeared to be conscious but unresponsive to external stimuli. The person's breathing was regular but shallow, and there was no reaction when Dalby spoke or moved around the room. When he asked direct questions about the individual's condition, Ambrose provided vague answers about chronic illness and the need for constant rest. The second bed presented an even more disturbing situation. The figure lying beneath the blankets appeared to be much smaller than would be expected for an adult, and there was no visible sign of breathing or movement. When Dalby requested permission to examine this individual more closely, Ambrose became extremely agitated and insisted that any disturbance could be life-threatening due to the delicate nature of the person's condition. Throughout his time in this room, Dalby noticed that the scratching sounds were much louder and more constant than they had been in other parts of the house. The sounds seemed to be coming from directly beneath the floorboards, as if there were some kind of activity taking place in the space below. When he asked about this, Ambrose claimed that the sounds were caused by plumbing problems related to the house's old heating system. Dalby completed his inspection with serious concerns about the health and safety of the Mordant family members. His official report documented numerous code violations that would normally require immediate corrective action or evacuation of the residents. However, the report also included notes about the family's apparent psychological state and the possibility that they might be suffering from some form of mental illness or delusion that prevented them from recognizing the severity of their situation. Based on Dalby's recommendations, the county initiated proceedings to require the family to address the most serious health code violations within 90 days or face forced relocation to alternative housing. However, before any legal action could be taken, an event occurred that would forever change the official understanding of what was happening at the Mordant property. On February 14, 1962, Deputy Sheriff Franklin Morris received an emergency call from a telephone operator who reported that someone from the Mordant property had attempted to place a call but had been unable to communicate clearly. According to the operator's log, the caller had been breathing heavily and attempting to speak, but the only clearly audible words were, "Help us," repeated several times before the line went dead. Since the family had not been known to use telephone communication for several years, this call was considered sufficiently unusual to warrant an immediate investigation. When Deputy Morris arrived at the property, he found the front door of the farmhouse standing open, which was unprecedented according to all previous reports about the family's behavior. The house appeared to be empty, with no response to his calls or knocking. As he entered the building, he immediately noticed that the oppressive odor that had been reported by previous visitors had intensified significantly, to the point where it was difficult to breathe normally without covering his nose and mouth. Morris's investigation of the house revealed that most of the rooms were in the same condition that had been documented by the health inspector 2 months earlier. However, the second-floor bedroom, where the elder Mordants had supposedly been confined, was now empty, with the beds stripped of blankets and no sign of recent occupation. The heavily sealed windows had been opened, allowing natural light into the room for what appeared to be the first time in years. Most significantly, the door leading to the basement area that had been sealed during previous visits was now standing open. The elaborate system of locks and bars had been removed, though they were lying scattered on the floor as if they had been forced off from the inside rather than unlocked normally. The opening revealed a wooden staircase descending into darkness, with the scratching sounds that had puzzled previous visitors now clearly audible from below. Morse descended the stairs with considerable caution, using his flashlight to illuminate the basement area. What he discovered there would form the basis of a criminal investigation that remained open for several years, though it never resulted in any arrests or prosecutions. The basement had been divided into several smaller rooms or chambers, each serving a specific purpose that suggested long-term planning and preparation. The first chamber contained what appeared to be living quarters that had been occupied for an extended period. Simple furniture, bedding, and personal items were arranged in a way that suggested someone had been residing in this underground space by choice rather than confinement. However, the condition of these items and the thick layer of dust covering everything indicated that the space had been abandoned for weeks or possibly months. The second chamber contained a workshop area with tools and materials that appeared to be related to various construction and modification projects. Many of the items found here corresponded to the unusual architectural features that had been observed in the main house, such as the sealed access panels and reinforced door frames. There were also materials that suggested more ambitious construction projects, including concrete mixing equipment and lumber that had been cut to specific dimensions. The third and largest chamber contained the source of the mysterious scratching sounds that had troubled visitors for nearly a decade. The walls of this room had been carved directly from the earth and rock beneath the house, creating a space that extended well beyond the foundation of the building above. The excavation appeared to have been done by hand over an extended period, as evidenced by the careful shaping of the walls and the absence of any mechanical tool marks. Within this excavated space, Morse discovered evidence of activities that he struggled to document in language appropriate for an official report. The walls had been covered with markings that appeared to be some combination of writing and drawing, executed in what looked like charcoal or possibly dried blood. The markings covered every available surface and seemed to tell a story or record a series of events, though the meaning was not immediately apparent. More disturbing was the evidence that this underground chamber had been used for activities involving human remains. Morse found several areas where the earth floor had been disturbed and refilled, suggesting burial sites. When these areas were later excavated by county officials, they were found to contain organic matter that was consistent with human tissue, though the remains were too deteriorated to allow for positive identification. The discovery of these underground chambers led to an intensive search for the 4 members of the Mordant family. However, despite extensive efforts by local law enforcement and state investigators, no trace of Nehemiah, Cordelia, Ambrose, or Delphine was ever found. Their fate remained unknown, and the case was eventually classified as a missing persons investigation that gradually faded from official attention as years passed without any new leads. In 1965, the abandoned Mordant property was seized by the county for unpaid taxes and auctioned to recover the outstanding debt. The winning bidder was a development company that planned to demolish the existing structures and subdivide the land for residential construction. However, before any demolition work could begin, the construction crew made a discovery that reignited interest in the mysterious family that had once lived there. While preparing the foundation for demolition, workers uncovered an additional underground chamber that had not been found during the original police investigation. This hidden space was accessible only through a carefully concealed entrance that had been built into the natural rock formation beneath the house. Inside this final chamber, investigators found a collection of documents and personal items that provided the first clear insight into what had actually been happening at the Mordant property during the years of their isolation. Among the documents discovered in this hidden chamber was what appeared to be a detailed journal or logbook that had been maintained by multiple members of the family over a period of nearly 20 years. The entries, written in different handwriting styles that presumably corresponded to different family members, documented a gradual descent into behaviors and beliefs that defied rational explanation. The earliest entries, dating from the late 1930s, described what appeared to be normal family activities and concerns. However, beginning in the early 1940s, the tone and content of the entries began to change significantly. The family members began documenting what they described as communications with entities that they believed were residing beneath their property. These communications supposedly provided instructions for modifications to the house and the creation of the underground chambers. As the journal entries progressed through the 1940s and into the 1950s, they revealed an increasingly elaborate system of beliefs and practices that centered around the idea that the family had been chosen to serve as guardians or caretakers for these underground entities. The entries described specific rituals and behaviors that were required to maintain this relationship, including the progressive isolation from outside contact and the modification of their living space to accommodate the needs of their supposed underground inhabitants. The journal also provided explanations for many of the strange behaviors and conditions that had been observed by visitors to the property over the years. The covered windows and sealed rooms were supposedly necessary to create the dark, quiet environment preferred by their underground companions. The unusual garden layout observed by the hunter in 1953 was described as a form of communication system that allowed the family to receive guidance about their daily activities. Most disturbing were the later entries, which described an escalating series of demands from their underground visitors. Beginning in the late 1950s, the family documented pressure to provide more direct forms of service, including what appeared to be offerings of food, personal possessions, and eventually more intimate forms of sacrifice. The entries suggested that failure to comply with these demands would result in severe consequences for the family members. The final entries in the journal, dating from early 1962, described a crisis in which the family realized they could no longer meet the demands being placed upon them. The entities they had been serving for nearly 2 decades were becoming more insistent and threatening, while the family's physical and mental condition had deteriorated to the point where they could barely maintain their basic survival needs. In these final pages, the family members discussed various options for resolving their situation, including the possibility of abandoning the property entirely or seeking help from outside authorities. However, they also expressed doubt that anyone would believe their story or be able to provide effective assistance against the forces they believed they were confronting. The last entry in the journal, written in handwriting, that analysis suggested belonged to Delphine Mordant, consisted of a single line: "We understand now what they really wanted from us all along." In addition to the journal, the hidden chamber contained a collection of personal items that provided additional insight into the family's final days. Among these items were several photographs that appeared to have been taken within the underground chambers, showing the family members in various stages of their descent into their final crisis. The photographs revealed physical changes in the family that were consistent with severe malnutrition and psychological stress. Also found in the chamber were letters that had apparently been written by family members, but never sent. These letters were addressed to various relatives and acquaintances from the family's past, and they contained apologies and explanations for their long isolation. However, the letters also included warnings about the property and urgent advice that no one should attempt to continue the family's work or investigate their disappearance too thoroughly. The discovery of these documents prompted a renewed investigation into the Mordant case, led by State Police Detective Raymond Holcomb. Detective Holcomb's investigation, conducted throughout 1965 and 1966 attempted to determine the actual fate of the family members and to distinguish between genuine criminal activity and the products of severe mental illness or delusion. Holcomb's findings, documented in a comprehensive report filed in 1967, concluded that the Mordant family had indeed engaged in activities that violated multiple state and federal laws, including the desecration of human remains and possibly homicide. However, the investigation was unable to determine conclusively whether these activities had resulted from genuine criminal intent or from severe psychological breakdown that had rendered the family unable to distinguish between reality and delusion. The question of what had ultimately happened to the 4 family members remained unanswered despite extensive search efforts. Detective Holcomb theorized that they had either fled the area entirely or had died somewhere on the property in locations that had not yet been discovered. The extensive underground excavations beneath the house created numerous possibilities for concealed burial sites, and the rocky terrain of the surrounding forest would have made it relatively easy to hide bodies in natural caves or crevices. However, there were aspects of the case that troubled Detective Holcomb and prevented him from reaching a completely satisfactory conclusion. The physical evidence found in the underground chambers suggested activities that would have required strength and coordination that seemed inconsistent with the severely deteriorated condition of the family members as they had been observed during their final years. The excavation work alone represented an enormous amount of physical labor that should have been beyond the capabilities of 4 increasingly frail and malnourished individuals. More puzzling was the sophisticated understanding of underground construction and excavation techniques that was evident in the chamber design. None of the family members had any documented background in engineering or construction, yet the underground spaces showed evidence of careful planning and execution that suggested considerable expertise in working with stone and earth. Detective Holcomb's final report acknowledged these inconsistencies, but concluded that they were likely explained by the extended timeline over which the excavation had taken place, and the possibility that the family had received assistance from unknown individuals who shared their beliefs or delusions. The Mordant property was eventually cleared and developed as originally planned, with the underground chambers filled in and sealed before construction of new residential housing. The development was completed in 1968, and the houses built on the former Mordant land were sold to families who were not informed about the property's history. However, the new residents began reporting problems within the first year of occupation. Multiple families described strange sounds that seemed to come from beneath their houses, particularly during the quiet hours of early morning. Several residents reported finding their basements flooded with muddy water that appeared to seep up through the concrete floors despite the absence of any identifiable source for the water. More troubling were reports from residents who claimed to have discovered small openings in their basement floors that had not been present when they moved in. These openings, typically only a few inches in diameter, seemed to appear overnight and were often accompanied by the scratching or scraping sounds that had been associated with the original Mordant property. When county inspectors investigated these reports, they found evidence of ongoing ground settling and water infiltration that they attributed to incomplete filling of the underground chambers. However, their efforts to address these problems by injecting additional fill material and sealers were only temporarily successful, with the same issues reappearing within months of each repair attempt. By 1969, 3 of the 5 families who had originally purchased houses on the former Mordant property had moved away, selling their properties at significant losses. The remaining residents reported that the problems had actually worsened after their neighbors' departure, with the strange sounds and water infiltration becoming more frequent and severe. The county's final attempt to resolve the ongoing problems occurred in late 1969, when a team of engineers and geologists was brought in to conduct a comprehensive study of the subsurface conditions. Their investigation revealed that the original underground chambers had been more extensive than anyone had realized, with connecting passages and additional spaces that extended well beyond the boundaries of the original Mordant property. More significantly, the study team discovered evidence that some of these underground spaces were still accessible and possibly still in use. They found signs of recent human activity in several areas, including fresh tool marks, recently disturbed earth, and organic matter that suggested the presence of food refuse or other materials associated with human habitation. These discoveries led to renewed concerns about what had actually happened to the Mordant family and whether their disappearance had been as final as originally believed. However, before any additional investigation could be conducted, the study team's equipment began experiencing systematic failures that prevented them from completing their work. The engineers reported that their electronic instruments malfunctioned whenever they were brought into the underground areas, and their lighting equipment failed with unusual frequency. More troubling was the fact that several team members reported experiencing severe claustrophobia and disorientation when working in the underground spaces, symptoms that none of them had experienced during similar work in other locations. After several team members became ill with symptoms that included severe headaches, nausea, and temporary hearing loss, the investigation was suspended indefinitely. The official explanation cited concerns about air quality and structural instability in the underground chambers, but team members privately expressed beliefs that there were other factors at work that could not be easily explained or addressed. The final chapter in the official record of the Mordant case was written in 1970, when the remaining residents of the development formally petitioned the county to buy back their properties and relocate them to alternative housing. Faced with mounting evidence that the development was uninhabitable and potentially dangerous, the county agreed to this unusual arrangement and purchased the houses at their original sale price. The properties were then abandoned and allowed to deteriorate naturally, with no further attempts at development or habitation. The underground chambers were sealed with concrete and metal barriers, and the surface areas were fenced off to prevent unauthorized access. Official county records classified the area as unsuitable for residential development due to geological instability and subsurface hazards. However, local residents of the broader Crow's Nest Hollow area continued to report occasional signs of activity around the abandoned development site. These reports typically described lights moving through the empty houses at night, sounds of machinery or construction work during the early morning hours, and the occasional appearance of human figures walking among the abandoned buildings. When county officials investigated these reports, they invariably found no evidence of unauthorized access or activity. The security measures around the site remained intact, and there were no signs that anyone had been living in or working on the property. However, the reports continued with sufficient frequency and consistency to suggest that something was indeed occurring at the site, even if it could not be documented or explained through normal investigative methods. The legacy of the Mordant family and their disturbing activities in Crow's Nest Hollow gradually faded from public attention as the years passed, and other concerns took precedence in the county's affairs. The official files were archived and largely forgotten, and the site itself became simply another abandoned development project in a region that had seen many such failed ventures. Yet for those who had direct experience with the Mordant case, either as investigators or as residents of the area, the memory of what they had witnessed remained vivid and troubling. Detective Holcomb, who had conducted the most thorough investigation of the family's activities, never spoke publicly about the case after filing his final report in 1967. However, according to colleagues who knew him well, he remained convinced until his death in 1982 that the full truth about what had happened at the Mordant property had never been discovered. Similarly, Dr. Patricia Reeves, the forensic psychologist who had been consulted during the investigation to evaluate the family's mental state based on their journal entries, continued to express doubts about the official conclusions long after the case was closed. In a private letter written to a colleague in 1975, she stated that the psychological profile that emerged from the family's writings was inconsistent with typical cases of group delusion or shared psychosis. According to Dr. Reeves's analysis, the Mordant family members had demonstrated a level of organizational ability and long-term planning that was incompatible with the severe mental illness that would have been necessary to explain their apparent delusions about underground entities. Their activities, while clearly disturbed and potentially criminal, showed evidence of rational decision-making and adaptive behavior that suggested they were responding to real environmental factors rather than purely imaginary threats. Dr. Reeves also noted that the family's isolation and secretive behavior were more consistent with efforts to conceal illegal activities than with the social withdrawal typically associated with shared delusions. In her professional opinion, the Mordant family had been engaged in activities that they knew were criminal and socially unacceptable, but they had successfully hidden these activities from outside observation for nearly 2 decades. The question of what those activities actually were and what had motivated the family to engage in them remained unanswered despite all the investigative efforts that had been devoted to the case. The official record concluded with speculations and theories, but no definitive answers about what had driven 4 apparently normal people to transform their home into an underground complex dedicated to purposes that defied rational explanation. In the end, the case of the Mordant family serves as a reminder that even in the well-documented modern era, it is possible for people to disappear completely, leaving behind only fragments of evidence that raise more questions than they answer. The mountains of Appalachia have always harbored secrets, and some of those secrets may be too disturbing for the civilized world to acknowledge or understand. The abandoned property in Crow's Nest Hollow remains sealed and empty, gradually being reclaimed by the forest that surrounds it. The concrete barriers that block access to the underground chambers are slowly cracking with age and weather, though no one has any intention of removing them or exploring what may still lie beneath. Some doors, once closed, are better left that way, and some questions may be too dangerous to answer. Those few individuals who remember the Mordant case prefer not to discuss it, and younger residents of the area are often unaware that anything unusual ever occurred in their quiet mountain community. The official records remain archived in county storage facilities, and the site itself has been largely forgotten by everyone except the occasional researcher or historian who stumbles across references to the case in old newspaper articles or police reports. Yet sometimes on particularly quiet nights when the mountain air is still and the forest sounds seem muted, local residents report hearing faint sounds that seem to come from the direction of the old Mordant property. The sounds are described as rhythmic scratching or scraping, similar to what visitors reported hearing decades ago when the family was still in residence. Whether these sounds represent some ongoing activity related to the original mystery, or simply the natural settling and decay of the abandoned structures, remains unknown. What is certain is that the name Mordant has become synonymous with secrets too dark to fully comprehend, and the hollow where they once lived continues to hold its silence, keeping whatever truths lie buried beneath its soil hidden from the world that was never meant to understand them.